Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone around the world. I am Paul Sisler, and this is In the Moment. Today, we have Matt Meyer. Matt Meyer is an internationally noted historian, orator, and organizer who serves as Secretary General of the International Peace Research Association, the world's leading consortium of university based professors, scholars, students, and community leaders. Meyer is the senior research scholar of the University of Massachusetts Amherst Resistance Studies Initiative. Active also with the International Fellowship of Reconciliation and the War Resisters International. The author, editor of over a dozen books, Meyer's work focuses on African peace and nonviolent studies, 21st century decolonization, the strategies and tactics of movement building, and political prisoners of conscientious and the abolition of white supremacy. South African Nobel Peace Laureate Archbishop Desmond Tutu, in his introduction to Meyer's first book, Guns and Gandhi in Africa, have looked beyond the short-term strategies and tactics which too often divide progressive peoples, and begun to develop a language which looks at the roots of our humanness. Argentine Nobel Peace Laureate Adolfo Perez Esquivel, in his introduction to Meyer's encyclopedic look at issues of U.S. imprisonment, Let Freedom Ring, added that his consistent work as a coalition builder provides tools for today's activists. With that said, let me bring in the one, the only, Matt Meyer. How are you? And did I miss anything?
No, Paul, that was a lovely introduction. Thank you so much. It's so exciting to be here with you today.
Well, thank you. And how are you doing today?
I'm well. It's a sort of lukewarm Monday here in New York City. Not too cold, not too hot, and like usual these days, we're not sure what climate it is or what season it is. We are just, thankful to have another bright day.
Yes, yes. Now I'm down here in Southern California where it's a beautiful 63 degrees and it's a little overcasty today, but it's still gorgeous out. Walked the pup earlier today. Beautiful day. Loving it. So tell us a little bit more about yourself and your travels to Africa and Europe over the last year.
So yes, I've been a New York-based third generation, U.S. citizen all my life, but my work is principally outside of the U.S. And I'm very proud to say that IPRA, the International Peace Research Association, is one of those peace and justice human rights organizations that really isn't U.S. centric and isn't Eurocentric. It's a truly international body that the vision of our founders about 75 years ago recognized that creating a big infrastructure and bureaucracy was not the best thing to do, was not conducive to the work for peace and human rights that is our focus. And so rather, they created a very tiny infrastructure and a board and council that is based majority global south. So our council has been made up for a long time with 4 representatives, 2 men and 2 women from Africa, 4 from Asia Pacific, 4 from Latin America, 4 from Europe, and 4 from North America, which means when you put them all together, majority global south. And that's really the way international organizations, in my mind, should be built. But so many have a top-heavy European or U.S. focus, and I'm happy that we do not. It was therefore a little bit of I don't know if it was a fluke or it was a little unusual when some years ago the organization voted this white guy from New York to be their Secretary General. And it's been an honor to serve in that position since the beginning of 2018. We're term limited, so my term will be up one of these days, but I'll still, of course, play an active role in building this global coalition of scholars, students, and activists. And, because my first years, because most of my work, as you read, is in Pan-African focused work. My first years pre-COVID, when after I was elected, was to travel to parts of Asia and the Pacific where I hadn't been before. Therefore, when COVID hit and travel was impossible, it became more and more crucial that some of the other regions that I hadn't been to recently, um, I wouldn't say they were neglected, but at least for me personally, I hadn't been able to play a role in helping the regional associations in those areas. So for the last 8 to 9 months, I have been gloriously traveling all throughout Europe, East and West, and all throughout Africa, Central, Western, and East Africa, as well as some of the coastal areas. And I have to say, I actually was just writing this up last night in preparation for the opening of the Latin American Peace Research Association, which is going to be next month in April. I'll be traveling to Chile, to Santiago, Chile, next month. And I was just writing up my remarks for that opening. And I have to say, the travels I've been on this last year have shown much more hope, much more hope, much more positive developments than I could have hoped for myself. I mean, I think in order to be an organizer, in order to work for peace, you have to tend a little bit. You have to lean a little bit towards optimism, because
Yeah.
otherwise it's hard to keep doing the work. But it wasn't just utopian sense of oh my God, we have to think positively. There really are extraordinary projects going on in many hundreds, thousands, countless grassroots communities throughout the world that we often hear and know very little about, even with all of our media savvy and all of our connections. And maybe I'll just name a couple, and then Paul, I'll take a pause so you can ask some questions. But I was most recently in Burkina Faso, which is a West African country, not necessarily so well known outside of the Francophone, the French speaking peoples of that region. It came into prominence. In fact, it became the name Burkina Faso. It used to be called Upper Volta when a revolution took place in the early 1980s and a new leader, Thomas Sankara, took power. After only 4 years, Sankara was killed in a military coup in 1987, and there have been various forms of military rule in that country since that time. But a number of us have been thinking and hearing and noting that in the last years, in the last 4 or 5, maybe 10 years, some of the Sankara vision of positive, radical social change was regenerating, that new generations were building up and talking about it, that Sankara's legacy was being rebuilt. And, there are two parts of that legacy worth noting. He was someone who was very focused on the working people and the poor people of this country. He said, I'm not going to take a salary commensurate to most presidents in Africa or around the world. I'm not going to drive around in big, fancy, cars. I'm going to just take a regular working person's salary and run the country as best it can for the majority of the people there. The other thing is, he said, women have to be at the fore. Women have to be at the forefront of the leadership. So more than most leaders in Africa or anywhere in the world, he really created policies and positions of women's leadership in the Burkina Faso government. After 87, 88, that got destroyed, 30 years of dictatorship. But in the last few years, and especially in the last year, and I'll say especially in the last 2 months, there's been a wave of changes bringing back this pro-worker, pro-women leadership. And in fact, essentially during my time there in February, and then the last day of February 2023, the French military presence officially was swept out of Burkina Faso, escorted out based on popular sentiment, and Burkina Faso maybe moved another level towards independence. But again, that's one example. We got to meet with Sankara's family, his daughters. We got to meet with these young activists who have just set up a new center of Thomas Sankara. All is not great. All is not perfect anywhere in the world. But if you read the headlines, it sounds like, oh, it's violence, it's terror, it's this and that. And yes, you can find violence everywhere in the world. But in Burkina Faso, we also found a story of a new generation of exciting peoples based movement building that I saw in so many places I was at throughout my travels in the last year. So,
Wow.
good news.
Wow. Yes, yes. Now I know I watch a lot of different things on like I get a lot more of my news from different YouTube segments from across the world and all that. Like World is One News, which is a India based news network, and even they cover a lot of the things that are going on in Africa that we in the United States, of course, we don't put that stuff out there because we don't want people to know what's going on, in this country. We, again, the mentality of the United States is the one and only. But I know that there's a lot of things going on, like in South Africa, trying to reform new government controls and stuff like that, trying to create their own constitution, laws, Congress, establishing government and stuff like that. And I know it's throughout Africa. There's a lot of countries that are trying to do this, but I've been watching a lot of things go on in South Africa. And I also realize that there's a huge Pan-African movement going on. And I know there's different aspects of Pan-Africanism where you have some groups that are a little more solitary in their belief system, but there's also a lot of these groups. A good friend of mine, Plamedi, who's a huge advocate for Pan-Africanism, where love is basically the currency. Everybody should be loving everybody. In your travels in Africa, because I know that prior to this last trip that you did, you'd been in like over 60 countries, and now you've added like another 30 or 40 to that. How much travels and how much work did you do in relation to Pan-Africanism, in relation to the forming of governments?
Yeah. Okay. Wow. There's a lot of questions in that question, and a large part of my heart is in South Africa still. I did a lot of work during apartheid, at the end of apartheid, mainly from outside, and then post apartheid South Africa. But the Pan Africanist piece is key. The love piece is key, and I'll try to talk about a few of those things. So I'm going to start with it. I'm going to start in Tanzania. I'm going to start in East Africa with the founding president of modern Tanzania, Julius Nyerere. Now, Nyerere is noteworthy because when you talk about love and social change, I always think of these two figures, Mohandas Gandhi and Ernesto Che Guevara, because even though they're not often thought of in the same breath, um, Gandhi and Che both said that love had to be at the center of all revolutionary thinking. They both had very similar ideas about social change. And, Gandhi called it satyagraha, which often translates to soul force, and sometimes it's translated to truth force. But one of the Indian scholars that I work with in the last decades of his life, Narayan Desai, who like me talked about revolution, and the phrase they used in India was total revolution. I tend to talk about it as revolutionary nonviolence. But for Narayan, whose father was Gandhi's personal secretary and who's written some of the best work on Gandhi's actual life and impact, not the myth, but the man and his movements. And he said Satyagraha, more than anything, was really about love force. And of course, Che Guevara, the great, leader of Cuban Revolution and armed struggle and Foucaultism, and obviously he was a Cuban leader, but he was from Argentina. And Che, of course, famously said that, for all revolutionaries, in truth, at the risk of sounding ridiculous, we have to understand that we are driven by love more than anything else. So Che and Gandhi have this piece that speaks to what you spoke to as well, and what you said your Pan Africanist friend, who I know has been on this show, also speaks to. And I think it is something that we see running throughout Pan Africanism today. And yes, there's not one but many Pan Africanisms, like all ideologies, socialism, communism,
Right.
even capitalism, which is less an ideology and more a business system for many, but it is an ideology as well. You know, we have more than one strain, we have more than one way of doing anything and everything. And I think in South Africa today, 2023, you know, we're faced with what Nyerere called a flag independence, but not a full independence. I said I was going to start with Nyerere, and I started talking about Gandhi and Che. But Nyerere was an early Pan Africanist. By the way, Nyerere was distinctive because he saw what happened with Gandhi. And he said, I am not going to allow, when I get memorialized and when I die, to be called the great soul, Mahatma. And I still prefer to call the man Mohandas because I think that idealizing and making into saints our human social change activists don't help us. They just make it feel like people have to be saints in order to do anything and make any change. And that's never been true. So Nyerere said, if you call me anything, if you give me any title other than my name, please call me Mwalimu, Mwalimu, which is a Swahili word for teacher. He said, before I became the first president of Tanzania, the founding father of this country, I was a high school teacher. I was a secondary school teacher. So you can call me Mwalimu. So Mwalimu Nyerere used to say, Africa and the whole world got flag independence, got flag independence. We got to elect our own officials, but we never got real independence. We never got true decolonization
Right.
from the countries and the businesses and the corporations that control most of what our people face. So you can elect your president, but that president often has no power or very little power. I was talking about Burkina Faso, and by the way, one strand or one stream of Pan Africanism is at the center of some of that young politics. So the new center, Thomas Sankara, is part of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, that network of Pan Africanist scientific socialists who follow Kwame Ture, Seke Ture, and others. And the fact is, in Burkina Faso, there's not a Burkinabe currency. The currency of Burkina Faso is the same as all of French West Africa. And that currency, which is the same of all of French Africa, you might say, oh, that's great. It's like the European Union, the UE. They have a euro, they have their own currency. No, 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 no. Because unlike the euro and the EU, the French West African currency is printed in and controlled by Paris. So the French, even though the military was kicked out in Burkina Faso just in February, just last month, the currency, the economy of all of those countries are still controlled by France. So this is the point of Nyerere, and this is the problem of South Africa today.
Okay.
More than ever in South Africa today, you have an end of political apartheid, which was wonderful, and you have an increase in economic apartheid, which is devastating.
Yeah.
And, you know, my friend Patrick Bond, who's a scholar there, talks about talking left, but walking right, about sounding like you're working for the people, but in fact, creating structures, often business structures, often economic structures, that are
Yes.
not for the people at all. And so that's the struggle in South Africa today. And it's really the struggle in all of the world. But you see, when you see conflicts in South Africa today, political, social, grassroots, violent conflicts, almost all of the roots of those conflicts are about this. Now I'm gonna switch to I dealt with love, I dealt with South Africa, and you said Pan-Africanism. So I remember your questions. Loop around to your Pan-African questions, and then I'll pause again to take a breath. But you know, I feel like Pan-Africanism, like my stories about Burkina Faso, are very positive. And I'll even loop one other thing in. For those people who are really careful observers of you, Paul, and of this wonderful show, you'll note that the advertising you did for this show doesn't mention Burkina Faso. It does mention South Sudan, Juba, and Cape Verde. So I'm going to say briefly, uh, it was in South Sudan in November of last year, 2022, that we had not one, not two, but three gatherings in the course of the month, one flowing from the other. They were not the same, but they were interconnected, of different types of Pan Africanists and different types of international allies from throughout the continent and throughout the world, who are beginning to talk to one another about how we can better network together despite ideological differences or geographic differences, linguistic differences, or sociocultural differences, how we can unite, how we can better unite so that a broad and diverse Pan African vision can help from the grassroots level move people forward, despite the economics or politics of governments and especially superpowers. And it was another example of this hopeful moment. It was glorious because we had groups like the Catholic networks of Pax Christi, or there's a network of Catholic university schools that actually has their president based in Tanzania, peace studies programs at colleges throughout the continent. You had the Episcopal network, and the Anglicans in South Sudan were essentially our hosts there. The Archbishop and Primate of South Sudan was not only our logistical host, but he was with us, and the many, many bishops and leadership were with us in conversation about social change. But also lots and lots of atheists and agnostics and spiritualists, and really, when you talk about, diversity, socialists, communists, capitalists, people from every corner of the continent facing many different conditions, often conflicting and conflict based issues, but figuring out how we can build peace with justice, how we can build human rights and nonviolence from a people's based perspective. And it was very exciting. And we had partners there as well. So some of the organizations you mentioned, International Fellowship of Reconciliation, my organization, IPRA, but also the International Peace Bureau, which is, by the way, the winningest Nobel Peace organization. They themselves got the prize. Their president got the prize, and a dozen or so or more of their affiliates over the decades have gotten the Nobel Prize. But mainly, let's say it's the largest grouping of groups, network of networks working for peace around the world, and they had their key African leaders there as well. So there is this Pan-African, I think, space, this idea of possibility that we're seeing growing. And in Juba, at least in November of 2022, we saw those folks coming together in one space at one time to say, across our divisions, across our differences, how can we build a larger, fundamental, uh, continental and global Pan-African movement for change? More good news. More good news, man.
Yes. Okay. I'm going to get to a couple of questions here submitted by Bryce. And before you respond, I want to add to it before we go further with it. Bryce says, sometimes I'm frustrated that these international committees, because they make strong declarations, but often nothing much happens. And he followed it up with, what's the current bottleneck to empowering these international committees? Have things improved in this regard at all recently? And what I want to say to it first is the American perspective is that they hear NATO, they hear United Nations, they hear like the ICC of The Hague, which just issued warrants for Putin's arrest. Okay. And yet it's like, well, nothing's going to be done. Nothing's going to be done. And when a lot of Americans, when they hear about these international committees and stuff that are out there, are they actually doing anything because they have no power? And because in the United States, all we hear about is they issued this, they issued that, and nothing gets done. When I know that there's a lot more going on behind the scenes, and it's not so much about um, trying, it is about getting things done, which, yes, we do need more empowerment to get those things done. But we're also looking at, there's a lot of international committees that are doing more than just issuing warrants. They're actually organizing and getting people together and forming governments and stuff like this also. So there's a lot of things that we don't know about in the United States because we're not shown that media wise, education wise, etc. Go ahead, Matt.
So I think that's really true. But I also I love Bryce's question, and I think it's an important and poignant one because, first of all, there's stuff as you were saying, Paul, between the governmental, intergovernmental, and non-governmental. So, International Criminal Court, NATO, UN bodies, and then governmental U.S. bodies are themselves spaces for tremendous inaction and inertia. So even though some of these declarations are significant and are important, it's also true that some of them have almost, sometimes it feels like they have nothing but bottlenecks. It's all bottleneck. But I'm going to take another piece of what I heard Bryce's question to be, because I am one of those strange people who's the CEO, the Secretary General of an international organization, International Peace Research Association, that really agrees with his critique. And some of my answer to his question is already in what I said earlier. I'm very proud of IPRA, and there are lots of international organizations I've worked with in my life. Some of them I've led, and many of them I still work with. I don't believe in burning bridges. Keep friends and try to work together on as many things as you can, even if you find differences. But the fact is, I'm very proud of IPRA in its creation of an almost non-existent infrastructure. We have no staff. I get no money, and I have almost no money. The money I have to work with to build stuff is money I can raise. And the idea behind that was specifically about not creating bureaucratic administrative bottlenecks in our international organizations, but rather putting all 99% into the grassroots where the work really gets done and where the work has to get done. It has to. No declaration, no policy, no project, even a successful project done at the international level purely is going to effectively support the grassroots as much as projects that come from the bottom up. And that's decades of experience all throughout. Okay, it's been 109 countries I've been to in the world so far. And the fact of the matter is, I really think that, yes, what Bryce is speaking to is true. We become international organizations, and some national and regional organizations become great at writing manifestos and creating declarations and even occasionally creating ideas for projects that never get off the ground. Heck, my organization is an academic one. We're great at writing books. We can produce books all year long. But, many of the scholars, I have to say, and we are marked by being a group of scholars who's also interested in social change and activism. So we're academic activists. We have a foot in both worlds. And a growing number of my colleagues are saying, and I'm proud of them for this, they're saying, do we really need another book on that subject? Is that, if we produce that book, how is that actually going to help people? How is it actually going to help people on the ground? Is it going to? What can we do? So I think these questions are the key questions. We don't have all the answers to them. Let's be clear. But again, just reflecting on Bryce's question, the best news of my travels is not we're also often good. And I said I was going to Chile, on the screen, in the bottom of the screen, in addition to my LinkedIn and Twitter, there's also this website, IPRA2023.org. That's going to be our major biennial conference happening in middle May 2023 in Trinidad. And we're great at doing these conferences, and the conferences are great. If people can come, if not, there'll be information on the website about how you can join in virtually. But the fact of the matter is, events are lovely, but often you can go from one event and then the next event a year later or 2 years later, and that's it. It's just event to event to event. And that's not going to change the world the way we need it to either.
Right.
So the key is not just to create better events or write better manifestos or produce even better books. The key is to understand that at the international and even regional level, the work is not as central as empowering local people on the ground, on the front lines, to build their own alternative institutions, whatever they need. And it's going to be slightly different in every place. Is it a school? Is it a hospital? Is it a community center? Are you building for an alternate election because your local leaders, so-called representatives, aren't representing you? Do you need to create an economic structure? In Venezuela, which is, both filled with revolutionary fervor, even echoing from the days of Hugo Chavez and the Bolivarian experiments to unite the peoples of that entire region of the world. With all of the U.S. Blockades and economic restrictions and embargoes, money became scarce and difficult, paper money. And even though most of what we read in the U.S. about Venezuela is propaganda and false, and in my visits and experiences, things in Venezuela aren't nearly as bad, not nearly as bad, politically, economically, or otherwise, than what most people outside of the country read about. On the other hand, there was an issue of cash flow and money. People weren't starving, but it was an issue. What did people on the local level, in small communities at the center of Venezuela, Afro-Venezuelan communities, what did they do? They organized a system that they call trueque, which is essentially translates to trade, where you'd have once a week these huge markets, but they weren't markets where people bought and sold things. They're markets where people traded. These farmers produced those things. Those farmers produced these things. And these folks weren't farmers, but they had services they could offer. And everyone figured out what they had, what they needed, and how they could put those needs and those products together in a bartering system that had nothing to do with the cash money that wasn't really about their lives. No one eats cash money. No one builds houses on cash money. So trueque was a very grassroots and extremely effective method of dealing with the international monetary system versus the local needs. I'll give another example. One of the projects I'm involved with from an international coordination level and solidarity level, but that is really looking at grassroots, is bringing together into conversation. And frankly, we've done it via virtual media. It hasn't mainly been in-person meetings in this case. And there's a way in which we need in-person meetings, but in a way in which there are things we can do in our Zooms, in our stream spaces.
Right.
But 8 groupings, and this is not the whole of the world, but 8 groupings of people who are still direct colonies, who are still under direct colonial rule, and not from one part or another part of the world, not from one ideological or another ideological group in the world, but the common theme of being under direct colonial control brought together 8 peoples who began sharing their experiences, not yet sharing their resources. Again, there's not much in-person thing and geographically continents apart, but sharing strategies and tactics of what was effective in surviving and thriving at this moment in history. So the Occupied Peoples Forum, which includes people from Puerto Rico, colonized by the US, and
Right.
Palestine, colonized by Israel, a Jewish state, Tibet, colonized by China, and Kashmir, colonized by India, Kurdistan, Rojava, Western Papua, and Western Sahara, colonized by Morocco, a Muslim country, and Amazonia, and I'm trying to think if I've left any of the 8 out, but you get the sense here that these are diverse peoples under different conditions of colonialism. But nonetheless, the idea was, since they're facing a similar issue, a similar problem, a similar dynamic, that sharing what's been effective on the frontline levels, on the grassroots levels, on the community levels for each of these people to provide insights to the others about how to survive and thrive in 2023 and beyond. So I think that's the answer to Bryce's question. We have to build a world, we have to build social change movements that may get support and solidarity, and maybe in the case of this broadcast of your work, Paul, a little bit of information in places
Yes.
that don't usually have them. But the actual work's not going to come from the international centers. The work is going to come from the grassroots.
Right. Definitely. Definitely. I just watched a video yesterday. This zip plane, they have these drones. It's in Rwanda, and these drones they ship blood and medicine to hospitals and stuff. And this survivor, um, as a kid growing up, started creating these things and ended up creating these drones that they would shoot out, and it goes like 150 kilometers out. So a hospital that's like 4 hours away in like 20 minutes can get, type O blood that will save a person. And it's like they also have a local thing where the drone flies up in the air and it drops down this little package via a zip line. And they built this out of nothing. And when they first started it, I mean, literally, they had fishing poles set up to catch the drone when it was coming back with a line across it. And when I was watching this innovation and this creation, and now what they do is they are like a local blood bank that is shipping blood to hospitals that normally would have to wait 3, 4, 5 hours to get it, can now get it in 15 to 20 minutes, and the lives that they're saving. So again, on the community level, these things become the improvements. And my stepson and I were watching that, and we were just so blown away at the innovation. And then, of course, part of the statistics is that like the economic growth is 4 times higher in Rwanda than what it is in the United States, and their criminality is 80% lower than what it is in the United States. So they're obviously doing something right over there, where here we're running the same wrong things and we're reverting and going backwards in time. I mean, just like when what first introduced me to you is when I came across the tribunal 2021, where the United States was found guilty on 5 counts of genocide. Nobody knows about this. Nobody knows about it. It never hit the media. Well, of course it wouldn't, because that would be against the United States, and we don't want people to know about that.
Yeah, no, I love the examples you gave, and I think there are so many levels in which they cut across misinformation and confusion. And there is a way in which too much information becomes a way of not thinking, and a way of like, we have access to everything and knowledge of nothing. Like somehow our knowledge level is going down. Uh, our intelligence is going down as our access to information goes up. It shouldn't be that way, but it does seem like that's what's happening. But yeah, I mean, when people think of Rwanda, they think, for understandable reasons, of genocide
Mm-hmm.
and they think of war and horror, and yes, it's been some years, but the movie Hotel Rwanda was a great movie in
Excellent.
some ways, and the issue of the Rwandan genocide, was and still is an extraordinary, great tragedy. But it's as if we have these places and spaces frozen in time. We have the Holocaust, we have the Rwandan genocide, and then we have no sense of what goes on, next door. So I think the significance of the 2021 International Tribunal on U.S. human rights abuses against Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples was a really important space to shine the spotlight where often things are very, very intentionally kept hidden, kept in
Right.
the dark. And the idea that not just during the Middle Passage, not just during the slave times, not just in 1776 at the founding, but throughout the history of the US, and most importantly, throughout the current US, there are policies which, when looked at from an international human rights lens, from international definitions, end up being ongoing acts of genocide. And so, what the 2021 tribunal did echoed what the great sociologist, the father of modern sociology, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, did 70, now 71, 72 years ago, what the great scholar and actor and musician Paul Robeson did when they said, we charge genocide. This was 1951. And it was charges from African American, from Black U.S. leaders saying that there's genocide that's going on in the Black community in the U.S., perpetrated and supported by the U.S. government. Now, this is 51. This is before the rise of what we call the civil rights movement, what
Right.
Vincent Harding, who worked very closely with Dr. Martin Luther King, called the Southern-based, Black-led U.S. freedom movement. He said civil rights was a name given to us by others. But even since the 50s, we talk about I have a dream as if it's this sort of dreaming idea, but 63 in Washington, when King uttered those words and many other people gave speeches, the part of that speech that's not quoted as often is, we've come to claim a check that the US owes us, that when we've tried to claim before, it's been marked insufficient funds. The promise of freedom, the promise of freedom has never been fully granted. So we looked at those 1951 charges of genocide. And then we looked at what Minister Malcolm X talked about and was building for in the last years of his life, when the Pan-African movement was at its early stages and countries were getting independence. Yes, maybe only flag independence, but independence nonetheless. And
Right.
they formed something called the Organization of African Unity. Now it's known as the African Union, the AU. And Minister Malcolm El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, in kind and in keeping with that Pan-African ideal and understanding the importance of Blacks in the US as key parts of it, formed the Organization of Afro-American Unity, the OAAU, to build on these ideas that the US could not judge itself. There's a great logic to that, right? The
Yes.
U.S. could not, just the way, you say if you're a lawyer defending yourself in court, you have a fool for your client. The doctors, the medical ethic that you can't operate on a member of your own immediate family. So the U.S. could not judge itself in terms of its human rights issues and abuses against its own people. So the OAAU And Minister Malcolm said, and others around him, we have to take the U.S. into the international arena. It's not a civil rights issue. It's an international human rights issue.
Yes.
The U.S. has to be brought before a world court, before an international tribunal of international accredited scholars and leaders to say what is happening in that country around Black, around African, around Indigenous peoples. And so, from picking up from W.B. Du Bois, picking up from Minister Malcolm in 2021, a group of us, a group organized by something called the Spirit of Mandela Coalition. Spirit of Mandela Coalition. And that is also a website that people can look at. Simply the words Spirit of Mandela, all strung together, spiritofmandela.org. And the fact of the matter is, we put together, or we help see an assemblage of 9 internationally accredited jurists, a member of parliament from South Africa, Spirit of Mandela. We actually had Nelson and Winnie Mandela's daughter provide a message that opened the tribunal. A leader of the United Nations Permanent Forum on the People of African Descent. Leaders of this group I just spoke of, the International Peace Bureau, the most Nobel Peace Prize winningest organization in the history of the Nobel Peace Prize. So we had this international grouping, these scholars who were experts in issues of genocide, experts in issues of minority rights, experts in issues of, human rights in general. And they listened to days and days of testimony from people all around the United States talking about 5 counts. 5 counts that were assembled by a team of lawyers saying, this is what we understand to be the nature of the U.S. government historically and today. So they looked at the question of police brutality and police violence.
Yeah.
They looked at the
that
issue.
real quick.
There we go. Oh, and this is the indictment. They looked at issues of mass incarceration and the whole question of the prison industrial complex as a site where slavery continues in some ways. They looked at the 3rd count on the issue of political prisoners. They looked at the 4th count in terms of environmental racism. And they looked at the 5th count in terms of health and health services. I think I inverted the 4th and the 5th, but 5 counts.
No, you had them in order. You were correct.
Sometimes I mix them up, but those were the 5 counts. And as the screen now shows, the independent panel of international jurists found the U.S. guilty on all 5 counts. So we're now in a situation since the end of 2021 where the U.S. has been found guilty of genocide on
Yes.
5 major human rights counts, major human rights violations that amount to, when you put them together, ongoing policies of genocide against Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples in the U.S. And so when we look at that reality and we look at that verdict, and those of us who are internationalists and who travel around the world look at bringing this news, which so many, as you point out, Paul, haven't heard of. And it's worth saying, Paul, you were, because of your own work, a member of the advisory committee of the tribunal. So you helped provide documents that the jurists saw. One of many, but your stuff was not an insignificant part of that. And so the idea that we have these 5 guilty counts of genocidal policies, what next? And we're coming towards the end of the hour, and I know many of these shows go well, a little bit over, but I said I would commit to sticking to an hour,
Yes.
and then I'll come back and we'll continue the conversations because you and I could always talk for another hour, another hour, another hour. But the fact is, there are two things I think worth saying about the what now. One of them is on the international level, we're going to keep reminding folks, informing folks, telling folks at every forum we go to, at every conference we go to, about this guilty verdict and about the way the U.S. needs to be looked at in international human rights legal context. So, for example, in South Sudan, we met with one of the great leaders of the South Sudanese movement, a woman who's the head of the parliamentary caucus of South Sudan, herself a member of parliament, a former minister of agriculture, and she was absolutely fascinated to hear about what was going on in the U.S., which people don't understand to be anything other than this super rich nation with great democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think anyone and everyone who lives in the U.S. knows that even though we have lots of rich people, and even though we have elections, to characterize the U.S. as mainly a great, perfectly functioning democracy, or as a country where the streets are paved with gold and everyone is rich, that is at best a tremendous confusion about what the U.S. is. So the one thing is we'll bring that information to all these international conferences we go to. But the last thing I'll say about what to do with this information fits into Bryce's comment, which is on the screen as well now, about what U.S. citizens can do to best support the work. And that is, and this is really, it's almost more of an announcement than anything else, because we're really at the very, very beginning stages of it. So listening to this now in March of 2023, but also in the months and years that follow, the chance to plug into this work are only going to grow, which is that out of the international tribunal structure, out of the work of that space, that event, and the verdict, there has been emerging a grassroots initiative called the People's Senate movement. And we're looking to build the People's Senate in every corner of the US. It, it always takes money, it always takes direct political pressures, it always takes thinking about things on the federal level. But at this moment, more than any of those things that Bryce notes, what it's going to take is very much like what I said internationally, on the grassroots level, plugging into and building these local spaces where people talk about this People's Senate idea. In short, in simple, the idea is that the U.S. Congress and the U.S. Senate does not really represent the majority of peoples of the U.S. It's become such a special interest, such a moneyed space. Not that there aren't some good Congress people or aren't some good policies that come out, but that generally we need to build a people's movement and a people's structure for talking about the changes we need to make and talking about how we can implement those changes. So the People's Senate becomes a structure, becomes a space where hopefully in every state, in every city and town, in every corner, in every constituency, African peoples, Latino peoples, Chicano, Mexicano, Puerto Rican peoples, every indigenous nation in the US, the new African nation, all peoples find a voice in this structure to talk about writ large what we need to do to fully and radically transform this empire, which is clearly dying. And so I would say again, spiritofmandela.org, that website. If you look now, you'll only find little things. But as the weeks and months go on, that website is going to soon. It's actually literally has a new webmaster that's beginning to revise that site now. So you look at it now, it's going to be different a month from now, but it's going to have more and more about how on the local level, wherever you are in the US, you can plug into this people-centered movement. Doesn't matter if you have a lot of money, doesn't matter if you have a lot of influence, doesn't matter if you have a lot of organizing skills. But the more organizing skills, the better. We need organizers more than we need money. And plugging into this people-centered movement, I think, could be one of the next best vehicles for making some significant change in this country under the leadership of Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples, but ultimately with all of us together working for massive, monumental, radical change.
Definitely. Give me 1 second here. I'm trying to get the share this tab. Here we go. There's the website, Spirit of Mandela. Again, spiritofmandela.org. Again, go to it, please check it out. Educate yourself more on the verdict and the things that have happened in this country. I have had some correspondence with Magdalene Munsami from Africa. I believe it's South Africa. And
yes, she's the South African former member of parliament who
right.
was the chief jurist of the independent panel of jurors.
Right. And I've also spoken with, I had a very nice conversation with Alexander Hinton. He's an expert on genocide, and I got quite the education from that man. He is just a brilliant man.
He was one of the 9 members of the panel of jurists. He's
Yes.
the UNESCO chair on genocide, based here at Rutgers University, New Jersey. But when we talk about international independent panel of jurists, this is the caliber of people we're talking about. Yes, indeed.
Yes. So again, it's something that needs to be out there. People need to know more about it. People need to, again, become educated on what's really going on in this country. Because, again, if you listen to the propaganda that's put out there, thus the red herring effect, there's a reason why the word is effect. Because if you listen to enough of the propaganda, you start believing it and you think that's what the reality is. And it's not. So, please educate yourselves a little bit more. Look into some of these things. Of course, read my book. Of course, read Matt's books. We all want you to read our books, but get more involved with what's going on in the world, not just what's going on in the US, but get more involved with what's going on in the world and try to see a broader picture of things that are happening. Because if you don't and you contain in this tunnel vision, you're missing out on a lot of things that you could probably do to help change the world to make it a better place. And for the most part, I'm a humanist, and I look at the human value before property value, and this is what more people need to do.
Fantastic, Paul. Yes, red herring effect was an important part of the documents submitted to the tribunal and is an important book to read. But yeah, as you say, read our books as part of your work getting active in
Yes.
the struggle. Jalil Muntaqim, who was part of the steering committee of Spirit of Mandela and one of the people who testified, talks about the idea that we are our own liberators. We are our own liberators. And Jalil has a book by that title as well. But these books are meant to be aids, to be supplements, as you carry them with you along with getting active and getting organized. Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, one of the great Pan-African leaders, says there are 3 things you need to do if you do anything in this world: organize, organize, organize. And those 3 things are what we're all about if we're going to see any positive things happen in our lives, any positive things to actually make social change. So we've got to organize. And if the books help along that path, help us become better organizers, then so be it. But get involved. And I look forward to hearing from people who say, oh, yeah, I heard you on Paul's show, And then I got involved in the People's Senate movement, and the rest is history.
There you go. There you go. Matt, thank you again for coming on here. I greatly appreciate it. Very informative, very educational. We're definitely going to have to do this again. Definitely.
All right, Paul, a pleasure. Anytime. Keep up the
All
great
right.
work.
Don't take off yet. All right, everybody. Thank you again for participating. I truly appreciate it. And remember, be kind, be happy, and may good things come your way. Thank you.